Syria's war is a mess. After 4 years, the conflict is divided between 4 different sides on the ground. Each side has different foreign backers, and those foreign backers don't even agree with one another about who they're fighting for or who they're fighting against.
Bashar al-Assad has been in power since 2000. However, in spring 2011, the Arab Spring protests began because the Sunni Arabs, the largest demographic in Syria, were sick of their second-class status, the country's corruption, brutality, and inequity. Protests and increasingly violent crackdowns grew when Syrian security forces shot at peaceful protesters, killing 3 in the southern city of Daraa. From then on, Assad's troops shot demonstrators, abducted and tortured activists, and even murdered children. Obviously, Syrians started to defend themselves, accompanied by some deflectors from Assad. Assad's aim was to crush the rebels and their supporters by brute force, and so he deliberately targeted Syria's Sunni Muslim majority, civilian and rebel alike, for slaughter, with a goal to polarize the conflict on religious lines. He turned what began as a broad-based uprising against a dictator into sectarian war, with the religious minorities on his side. He knew this would attract extremists to the rebel side, which would make the rest of the world afraid of seeing Assad lose. Iran's Shia government supported Assad with cash, weapons, and soldiers. In part, it became a Middle East sectarian proxy war of Shia against Sunni.
Iran, which is Assad's most important ally, intervenes on his behalf. By the end of 2012, Iran is sending daily cargo flights and has hundreds of officers on the ground. At the same time, the oil-rich Arab states on the Persian Gulf began sending money and weapons to the rebels, mainly to counter Iran's influence and mainly through Turkey. Iran steps up its influence in turn in mid-2012 when Hezbollah, which is a Lebanese Shia group backed by Iran, invades to fight alongside Assad. The Gulf states respond by sending even more money and weapons to rebels, Saudi Arabia really leading the effort at this point, and this time going a lot through Jordan, who also opposes Assad. And by 2013, the Middle East is divided between generally Sunni powers on one side supporting the rebels and Shias on the other side supporting Assad. That April, the Obama administration, horrified by Assad's atrocities, signs a secret order authorizing the CIA to train and equip Syrian rebels. But the program stalls out at first. At the same time, the US quietly urges the Arab Gulf states to stop funding extremists, but their requests go ignored. In August, Assad uses chemical weapons against civilians in the town of Ghouta.
Men, women, children lying in rows, killed by poison gas. It is in the national security interests of the United States to respond to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons through a targeted military strike.
Russia proposed on Monday that Syria surrender control over its chemical weapons to the international community for its eventual dismantling to avoid a U.S. military strike.
The US ends up backing down, but the whole thing establishes Syria as a great powers dispute, with America against Assad and Russia backing him. Just weeks later, the first American training in arms through that CIA program finally reached Syrian rebels. The US is now a participant in the Syrian war.
A Sunni extremist group known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but now known as ISIS, which has mostly been defeated in 2007, was rebuilding itself. It grew strong fighting Assad in Syria, and later swept northern Iraq. By 2014, Syria was divided between government, also known as Assad, rebel, ISIS, and Kurdish forces. The Kurds, an ethnic minority, have long sought their independence. Syria is divided in a terrible stalemate.
In February of 2014, something happens that transforms the war. An Al-Qaeda affiliate, mostly based in Iraq, breaks away from the group over internal disagreements over Syria. The new group calls itself the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and it becomes al-Qaeda's enemy. ISIS doesn't fight Assad. Instead, it fights the other rebels and it fights the Kurds, carving out a mini-state in Syria that it calls its caliphate. That summer, it marches across Iraq, seizing territory and galvanizing the world against it. Then, in September, almost exactly 1 year after it almost bombed Assad in Syria,
We're moving ahead with our campaign of airstrikes against these terrorists, and we're prepared to take action against ISIL in Syria as well.
that summer, the Pentagon launches its own program to train Syrian rebels. But unlike the CIA program, this one will only train rebels who fight just ISIS, not Assad. And the program fizzles out, showing that America now opposes ISIS more than Assad, but also that there's really no like-minded force on the ground in Syria. In August, Turkey begins bombing Kurdish groups in Iraq and in Turkey, even as Kurds are fighting ISIS in Syria. Turkey also doesn't bomb ISIS in Syria. All of this deepens tension with the US over this question of whether they need to treat Assad or ISIS the primary enemy, and creates a lot of confusion among the Kurds about where the US stands. Now, Assad has been losing ground all this time, to ISIS, to the rebels, and in September of 2015, Russia intervenes in his behalf. Russia says it's there to bomb ISIS, but in fact it just bombs the anti-Assad rebels, including some rebels who are backed by the US. So as it stands now, there are lots of different groups and outside countries involved in Syria's war, and even among allies there are big disagreements about who their enemies are, who to support, and how to do it. And those contradictions are a big part of why, for this war, there is just no end in sight.
250,000 people have been killed and half the country's population has been displaced. It is quite shameful that only Germany and Sweden have completely opened up their countries to incoming refugees, and it is much needed with 4 million Syrians fleeing as refugees.